we're going to review the receiver cover complete, and the recoil spring or the main spring, it's perfectly fine to see it loose like this. No issues at all. It's within the design. When you see the springs, bent and moving around like this, perfectly acceptable. We're actually going to focus on the issues that you may find on a receiver cover. It's a striker spring, and it could be bent or kinked, and the striker spring guide rod. So that could actually be loose or bent. And this is actually a perfectly fine in-spec receiver cover complete. This is a surplus, a well-used surplus receiver cover. And as you can see, this is far from being rock solid. It actually has a lot of movement. At this point, some movement is okay. If you have a little bit of movement, kind of like this, that's acceptable. But when you start seeing movement to that extreme, really start looking at getting that replaced. That can actually cause bent springs, malfunctions where the spring doesn't feed or slide into the striker like it should during cycling, and really cause a major malfunction in your rifle. So when it starts becoming that loose, look at replacing the receiver cover. We also have replacement guide rods that are rock solid. So at Samuel Paul, we actually provide that. The next thing is a nice and straight striker spring. So this is actually perfectly straight, or as straight as it gets anyway. It rolls nicely. Yeah, you may see some, some flex to it, but that's really as good as it gets. So make sure you've got a nice straight striker spring. If not, replace it. Here's a good example of one that's kinked, and I remove this from a bent and loose guide rod. And it becomes very apparent when you roll it, you see all the issues with it. So it's not uncommon to see this on VZ58s. And when you see this, a lot of times it's because of a problematic guide rod. So if you see that striker spring bent like that or kinked, look at the guide rod. It may have to be replaced, and certainly this striker spring must be replaced. We're looking at the surplus bolt carrier, and this does not have a push-down plate. You can see there's nothing there. It's just the original surplus. And all VZ58s that are semi-automatic must have a push-down plate to prevent misfire issues. And you've probably heard this called the gremlin. And the gremlin basically is a dead trigger, and that results from the striker not being held during cycling to the rear when the bolt carrier group goes into battery with a live round. So the gremlin, that term is just really in common usage, so I'm just going to refer to it as a gremlin because it really sums it up quite nicely. So this bolt carrier in a semi-automatic VZ58 could result in gremlin issues. This bolt carrier actually has a welded on pushdown plate, and you can see some of the welds here. The weld on this side, very strong, it's not going to go anywhere, but there's a problem with this. This pushdown plate will cause you to have a gremlin issue. The reason being is that this area is sloped down, and it will not make proper contact for the with the semi-automatic disconnector. So you will have timing issues. The striker won't be held back to the rear at times by the sear, and when it's not, it actually rides home with the bolt carrier group, a live rounds in the chamber, and the trigger just is a dead trigger because the striker was never caught by the sear. So again, this is a bad position pushdown plate because it's not nice and horizontal there, and it's actually sloped downwards. So just because you have a pushdown plate doesn't mean you've got a functioning rifle or a functioning correct rifle. This carrier actually is a new production check small arms carrier. The push-down plate was not welded on, but again, it doesn't matter if it's welded or not. What matters is that this plate is nice and horizontal, and it's not sloped. And it's all about timing, so it connects with the disconnector to give enough time for the sear to basically pop up into position to hold back the striker. Okay, now this is how you're going to actually test to see if your rifle is functioning correctly with your pushdown plate. Pull back on the bolt carrier, squeeze the trigger, and you're going to release the bolt carrier completely under its own force. Do not ride the bolt carrier with your hand. Release the trigger, and you can see it's a dead trigger. And the reason being is the striker actually rode home with the bolt carrier group into battery. So the sear did not actually pop up into position in time to hold back the striker. So we're going to do it again. Pull back, squeeze the trigger, and do not let your hand ride forward even slightly with the bolt carrier group. If you do, it may not reveal a gremlin issue. So let it go forward, let it slingshot forward. Release the trigger, and you can see again a dead trigger. And this was the bolt carrier with that badly positioned pushdown plate welded onto it. And just because you have a pushdown plate doesn't mean you're not going to have the gremlin issue. Okay, now we have a bolt carrier with a properly positioned pushdown plate. So again, a good position pushdown plate, either welded or machined as part of the bolt carrier new, they're all good. So to test, again, pull back, squeeze the trigger, release quickly, release the trigger, and now you're going to squeeze the trigger to listen for that striker to basically dry fire. Okay, and that push down plate did its job. It's working. So one more time. Pull back on the bolt carrier group, squeeze the trigger, and you're going to release the bolt carrier group as quickly as possible so as not to hide a gremlin issue. Release it, release the trigger, and then we're going to squeeze the trigger to dry fire. And that bolt carrier with that plate is doing its job. The striker is another part on your VZ58 you really want to keep an eye on. They last many thousands of rounds, but my experience of repairing these over the years is that there's one design striker that's actually a little stronger than the other. And from the late 50s well into the 80s, the Czechs manufactured two different designs. This one here is the stronger design. It does not have a hole in the striker here. It just has this groove to engage inside the bolt carrier. So this is the one preferred, and if we do a trigger job on your VZ58, we really would prefer to see these strikers because they just last longer. They last many thousands of rounds. And since we modify the striker for your trigger job, of course we want to see the one that will just basically last the life of the rifle, and where you can pass it on to your kids and all that good stuff. The other thing, this is the design with the hole in it, and the hole will be here, and already there are two cracks that can be seen, one here and then one on this side. And it just stands to reason when you drill metal and it's a thin area of metal, it can only weaken the metal around it. So it's not surprising. And if I had to guess, probably the strikers with the holes in them were the earlier production ones, and then at some point during the production process, 60s, 70s, they came out with the other version without the hole in it. So if we do a trigger job on your VZ58, we highly recommend not doing it with the strikers with the hole. just so you have many, many thousands of rounds trouble-free through your VZ58.